Hello, everyone. I'm Frank Garza with Lean Startup Company, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. Today's topic is Lean Startup in Education, and moderating the discussion is our own Lean Startup Company faculty lead, Marilyn Gorman. Our guest is founder and CEO of 4.0 Schools, Matt Candler. In Marilyn and Matt's conversation, they discuss how early assumptions about what your customers want can hurt your credibility and waste time, why it's important to know the problem you're trying to solve and then having the courage to experiment in a small way, the importance of building something for a customer segment rather than a one-size-fits-all product for everyone, and much, much more. So with that, I'll hand things off to Marilyn.
Well, it is so great to have an opportunity to speak with you today, Matt Candler. Thank you so much for making time to join me on this webcast.
You bet, Marilyn. It's a joy.
Oh, fantastic. And 4.0 Schools is such an interesting and innovative opportunity. It's for educators and entrepreneurs really to work together. Matt, can you talk a little bit about it? Because I'm sure many people are not so familiar with 4.0 Schools. And tell us how you came up with the idea. What was the reason that you wanted to focus on the future of schools?
Sure. Well, thanks, Marilyn. It's fun to talk with you. I think many of the concepts that animate 4.0 come from Lean and the conversations that we all are a part of. So unfortunately, the story is not very sexy. When we started this organization, it was not very world-changing. It was, in its first iteration, a very simple mechanism for people to launch new charter public schools in the Southeast. So it was a year-long fellowship, including a lot of coaching, the equivalent of a $150,000 to $200,000 investment in an aspiring educational entrepreneur who wanted to launch their own school. And that's what our first cohort consisted of, 6 very amazing people who said, I think that's what I'll do. 1 or 2 of those folks were like, maybe a school, maybe not, but we were like, okay, well, just go with us. And a school will be a great thing for you to do. Meanwhile, one of my colleagues, 2 of my colleagues said, could we run a little experiment on the side? So this is the second year of our life as an organization. There are a lot of teachers here in New Orleans where we are based who want to try something new, but it's not a school. So could we give them a little help? And I was like, sure, let's spend a little bit of our time, see what you find out. And, sure enough, what came very clear within about a year of working with this much more diverse set of ideas and folks that didn't necessarily identify as entrepreneurs ready to quit their jobs, was they needed something very different from us. They needed something different than the 20 years of experience I had as a school builder. And so we hit this crossroads, Marilyn, in the second year of our organization, and we said we either continue to serve folks as a school incubator, or we pause that work and we listen to this new customer base who said, we need something special and different. Mm-hmm. And ever since that moment, and the phone call to funders to say what we raised money for is not what we want to do now, all the chaos and pain of that pivot has led to an unbelievably rich relationship with a community of entrepreneurs who come to 4.0 for something I'll describe in a very simple metaphor. So I like food metaphors. The way to think about how 4.0 has evolved in those 8 years is we are now the place for an aspiring entrepreneur who wants to make school better to come and receive the equivalent of all the coaching and investment that a chef would get if they were going to do a food truck version of their restaurant. And so that was a long-winded way to get to that metaphor. But there is such a lack of understanding and commitment to meeting people who have ideas about the future of school, that we've found this huge gap in the sequence of engaging people with ideas, that we felt the need to fill that gap. And so what we provide to people thinking about changing school is a safe place to start that idea and get it out of your head and in front of students and families in your hometown. And it comes with all the coaching, all the investment, and all the feedback that you need to get started.
Yeah, and it sounds like as well, and I know we talked on a different call about this idea that you provide coaching, capital, credibility, and I know I'm not doing this in order, but I love that one of them is community. So that you're providing a chance for people to work with like-minded people.
And, I don't know how many of your viewers have been in the classroom, but they probably all know someone who has. And, I do think that one thing we are really good at in education in this country is isolating those professionals from one another. It is arguably the most isolated and isolating of our caring professions, I would argue, and of all professions potentially. And so what you feel as my inner teacher knows what that isolation feels like, right? I mean, even physically, we are separated from one another as professionals and adults into rooms full of children. And so if there's one thing that we have stuck to as the thing we must always prioritize, it is being hospitable. That is our number one value. The first value on the list is hospitality. And we just feel that that is what's been missing from the profession and from the experience that students and families have in most schools in our country. The idea of serving you as a customer and acting as if we don't do our best, you might go somewhere else. That's just not part of the experience. And so I think that concept of community first and relying on that human interaction to define everything we do has become the most important part of what we do.
Oh, I can imagine. And as a former teacher myself too, I recognize exactly what you're talking about. I know that whether it's intuitive or whether it's learned, you are taking an experimental approach. And I'm sure you know enough, if not a lot, about Lean Startup, which is foundational to kind of a build, measure, learn approach. Can you talk about the kind of how you bring experimentation into what you're doing and what your fellowships are helping people to do?
Absolutely. And I really, we stole everything we can from everyone who wrote anything on the topic, from Steve Blank to the folks who continue to define the movement today. And we actually work closely with IDEO and the D School at Stanford.
Sure. Yeah. I know them well. Yep.
Yeah. So, and they've been so generous too, right? So that's another thing that I took away from that community. The folks who are defining what lean is and what human-centric design are just more generous and communal than we tend to be in teaching, which is tragic and ironic. One thing that I would say, Marilyn, I think that's really important is the concept of testing when it comes to schooling. And all of the very structural elements of race and class and poverty and wealth that define how schooling is delivered and experienced in our country, we often talk about the challenge of that simple word, to test. And so one of the things we do in our programming is when you come to camp, all of our fellowships begin with a camp experience of 3 days in New Orleans. And the first day, we talk about what ethical and humanizing testing looks like. And we talk about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And we talk about other experiments that were done in the name of science, but done at great harm and without any concern for the people being tested upon. And so there's a fundamental lens through which we look at this in Maryland, and that is that we test with and not on communities. And it's this, and again, this is core to lean. It is to cherish those first users that are willing to work with you when your product's still crappy and still very much in flux. And, treating them like gold and saying, the fact that you would work with me while I'm still working this out is something I should cherish. And that has really been one of the most powerful concepts of lean that we have taken away, which is that element even thinking about the Agile Manifesto, right? Like the primacy of the customer and the human, and not the technology,
Exactly.
that remains really fundamental to what we do.
Yeah. You know, I don't know how much you know about the 6-word project, but there's a great, it's just a way of only using 6 words to come up with really the essence of what you're thinking about. It's based on a story about Ernest Hemingway, who once was asked to write the world's shortest story, and he came up with 6 words, and it was for sale, baby shoes, never worn.
Wow.
But there's a 6-word story that I once read that I love, and it's must remember, people first, then technology.
So true.
And I think that often gets lost. And when I listen to you, Matt, as well, it also reminds me of conversations, because I obviously work much more with enterprise and with the government, and we're often hearing as a potential objection, oh, customers don't want to be part of experiments or tests. We can't do that. And yet the reality is, when we challenge that assumption, our customers, and it sounds like whether the customers are students, parents, community, or whether they're commercial customers, they really value being brought into the process. Absolutely. They value being treated as partners, not somebody having something done to. Yeah.
You know, absolutely, man. I'm hesitating to not draw on the wall too much, but my last day in our lab, we've been here for 7 years. I got to write on the wall one more time. You know, we think a lot about this very simple graph, and you know, this is Chris Anderson's long tail theory, right?
Yeah.
You know, very simple construct. But you know, if you think about Hollywood as home to the blockbuster, that represents the short tail. It's the most, you know, average product that most people will see. You know, this is where we see YouTube, right? And so many other platforms that illustrate what you're describing, which is my experience as a subscriber to my YouTube channels, is everything about being in the experiment with those creators as they grow their craft as content creators.
Yeah.
And that's a fundamentally different experience for me as a film watcher, a content consumer, as is my relationship with Hollywood. And it's this, the way I distinguish this, and I can't underestimate how profound this old way of institutional power and concentration permeates everything in our work. This idea of scale being vertical, right? The scale of a successful blockbuster is how vertical it gets in the number of viewers in that one movie. And the scale of Chris Anderson's theory of the long tail is that scale comes as a function of this x-axis. And yes, the 10 YouTube channels that I watch are not Hollywood blockbusters, but the costs of me adding as becoming a subscriber or someone else adding a channel is so low that long tail, the area under that curve is bigger than the area under this curve, right? And whether it's philanthropy or, as you know, government engagement in schooling, it is very, very difficult to break free from this left side of the graph thinking, because many people think, and it's all well-intentioned, but we think, well, we need what will work for all children.
Yes. Yeah.
There's no such thing as an average child. And so when we think about teaching individual human beings as they grow, there's more promise in thinking about scale going that way, because individualization and choice and personalization and scale on a human-to-human, creator-to-consumer relationship, and even the simple concept of YouTube and comments and that feedback loop informing, right? That is a much leaner approach to filmmaking than Hollywood sort of waterfall approach, if we're gonna kind of go there. And I gotta tell you, that was new to me when we started 4.0. And so really embracing that concept of lean has changed everything we do.
Sure. Well, and it makes perfect sense, because first of all, you're reducing the risk.
That's right.
You're not trying to build, I don't know if this is the right metaphor for the Hollywood approach, but you're not building a whole new school system. You're building something that is much more individualized, much more adaptable, and much easier to shift, to change if you need to based on what you learn.
And
So,
which becomes a more humanizing approach.
Of course.
That's exactly right.
So tell me a little bit about some of those early experiments, or I hesitate to use the word test anymore.
It's okay, no, we embrace it.
But what did you learn?
With integrity.
Yeah.
So we are testing, but we're testing together, not on you. At least
of course, yeah.
Trying to do.
So what were some of the early experiments or tests that you ran, and what were the failures that helped you to actually develop even greater learning? I know our listeners are always curious to hear about failures.
Well, I mean, it was a scary month when, after calling our first funder to say we wanted to pivot to do earlier stage investing, not larger scale sort of Hollywood style investing. Even as a nonprofit, we got down to a month of cash, and those are scary days.
Sure.
And that funder and some others eventually came back around and really embraced what we're doing. But this is what's fun. Again, I'll go back to that metaphor of the food truck. Let's say historically, a restaurant costs $1 million to $10 million. It's a 6-7 figure investment. Mm-hmm. A food truck in New Orleans, you can buy one for 4 figures, $5,000, maybe 10. Mm-hmm. But then if you go a whole nother order of magnitude, simpler and faster, there's the pop-up dinner. Mm-hmm. And, you've seen the food scene in New Orleans dramatically diversify and start to breathe away from simply Cajun and Creole food in the last 10 years because of these two technologies, the food truck and the pop-up dinner. And so I'll give you a great story of Electric Girls, which is an organization run by a woman named Flor Serna, who I met at a maker fair here in New Orleans 5 years ago. And Flor runs a series of summer, afternoon, and in-school experiences for young women to build their confidence in STEAM and engineering. Mm-hmm. And, Flor's pop-up, we use her pop-up as an example of what a great experiment looks like. She brought a small group of 10 or so young pre-adolescent girls from ages 6 to 12 together and said, today I'm going to teach you how to use wire cutters. And so you're going to learn this one skill, this tool. I'll show you what this is. And right now, you don't know what this is or how to use it. But in an hour, you're going to know how to use this. You're going to be really good at using this. And then after that, as you learn that, I'm going to show you some projects that once you learn how to use a wire cutter, you can create. And at the end of this 2-hour experience, these young girls who are intimidated and have dealt with, I'm a former middle school math teacher, all the negative messages of how they don't see themselves as successful scientists or mathematicians. Flor's able to condense that 2-hour experience into a confidence building exercise, and they build a circuit that comes to life and makes noise and lights up and is based on their design, might even be embedded in a piece of fashion that they design themselves. And those young women walk out more confident and more capable as engineers. And it does take some skill for an entrepreneur to hold fast on the big vision of what Electric Girls might be and put energy into that 2-hour version of it. And that to me is that is our craft. Our craft is engaging people who have huge, big, promising ideas of what school could look like. And then we teach them and we walk with them in this very uncomfortable journey to get to that pop-up meal version. And to have the same level of hope and optimism, but the discipline to create that tiny little version and start showing your customers that experience and then build from there back to the vision.
Of course, the smallest, simplest thing you can do.
That's right.
But I'm still curious to know about failures.
Failure, sure.
Or what you learned. Was there a significant pivot that you've had along the way where you tried something and you learned from your customers that this was totally wrong, but they helped you see a better way or a different way forward.
I think, if I just speak for myself as a founder of 4.0, I think that first year fellowship was a failure, because what we did is we said, we'll give you a full year's salary. And we'll say, you've got a whole year to think about what your school might be. And you know what happens? Many of those schools, when they first were created, were not very different. They were evolutionary or iterative at best, away from the best practices we already had. And so, that tension between comfort and discomfort and the raw fear of not knowing whether this thing's going to work, I think ever since then, we have continued to invest less and less where to start. So I think that was a failure because I didn't understand that.
Yeah.
I thought that people needed a comfortable year to explore. And what they really needed was the push to ship something in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And the support to know that even if that 2-week version stinks, you haven't jeopardized the millions of dollars that you're going to need from the local and state government.
Yep.
You haven't jeopardized the academic careers of the kids who will enroll in the school that's in your head.
Yep.
And in fact, as you just said, you've asked those parents and students to come into the process with you and create it together. Yeah. And that is a groundbreaking visual in a world where we just don't do that. We do not give parents and students the respect they deserve as co-creators. Yeah. And that was a massive failure on my part, because I thought that I knew what great schools would look like. And I was like, I'll just give you a year to hang out with me and go spend time in schools that are awesome. And then you too will build great schools. In fact, none of that first version of our program had anything to do with listening to students and families and saying, what would you want in a school?
Yeah. Yeah. But you had to go through it to be able to get that learning. And it's such a powerful story when you tell it as well too, Matt. Let's talk. I'd love to talk a little bit about the program that itself that you have with your fellowships, and I'm wondering if you can explain again to our listeners the difference between the Tiny Fellowship, the Essentials Fellowship, and how you find participants.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and of where that is headed, specifically how we find people. And again, I'll stick with my metaphor. The Essentials Fellowship is the first step for most of the folks that we invest in, and that is a 10 to 12 week fellowship. And that starts with the 3-day camp here in New Orleans, a cohort of 20 to 25 people from around the U.S., all of whom have pitched us on something that might change school or learning or the experience that children and families in their hometown have access to today. And so they share with us their vision of a new school or a new after-school program or a new attempt to make the experience in a school more diverse or more equitable or more inclusive, or an experience for families, for parents, to help them better advocate for themselves, for example. And so we listen to those, we read those ideas. Even if you aren't accepted into Essentials, we give you feedback on that idea so that you can keep working on it, and we invite you to come back. But if you're invited into that fellowship, you show up for that weekend, and then you get paired up with a coach who has gone through the program within a year. And a year, 2 years ago, most of our staff did the coaching. Now all alumni do. So you come together in a community of 20 to 25 peers doing all different kinds of things. We've tried it where let's bring all the school builders together, or let's bring all the technology focused ventures together. It turns out that heterogeneity is much more powerful than homogeneity. So it's less competitive. People are all into learning from one another and stealing. So in that weekend, you refine what it is. You go through these lean techniques of what does the customer need. So you're just trying to achieve a concept of what the customer and product fit is. And then you walk out of that weekend, okay, I know in the next 2 to 6 weeks, we'll give you 9, but we want you to do it as quick as you can, what a half day to a day or maybe a 2-day experience for your customers would be. $300 check, coaching up to $2,000 or $3,000 on the phone. And if there's a coach in your hometown, someone who will be there with you.
Better still, sure.
And then you tell us how it went, and we can invest 2 more times in that pop-up. And so that's the Essentials Fellowship, and it's just get that pop-up meal version out into the world. The Tiny Fellowship is the same construct, the same elements. Again, begins with community, lots of coaching, but you have 6 months to run a more food truck scale version, $5,000 of cash, up to $10,000 of coaching, and 6 months to get into a repeated interaction with your customers, just like with a food truck. You know, you start to get fans and you start to get into a deeper relationship with your customer so that they can give you more and more feedback about what that potential solution might be like.
Is there a different criteria for entry into the Tiny Fellowship? In other words, should they have been running a taco stand on the side of the road or something like that before they get to the food truck stage? It's interesting.
More and more, Marilyn, they're starting to blur. The lines between those 2 programs are blurring a little bit. We just had 40 teams here this weekend for the Tiny Camp.
Wow.
And close to half of those groups had gone through Essentials. So I think more and more we know that even in the time between reading your idea and you showing up for camp, things can change. And so I think we're trying to be much more flexible and say, if you can do those pop-up meals between now and camp, maybe we'll be ready to do that food truck scale by the time you get here. So I think the short answer to that is it varies quite a bit, and the more people get to know us, the more they can do this stuff on their own, and when they do get to camp, they're further along.
Yeah. Now, I know you're based in New Orleans, and I'm wondering how have you seen your efforts change the landscape of learning in your home city?
Yeah, it's a humbling topic, because when I moved here as a very self-righteous and very self-assured expert who had a lot of experience in charter schools as an area of expertise. And I came to town with a ludicrous amount of hubris and certainty that I knew what this city and what the families of this city would need as solutions. And I look back on that, and it's embarrassing to realize how egotistical that was.
Yeah.
You know, and I think, so what I am trying to do is to acknowledge that is a structural flaw in the way power is distributed, in the way privilege is exercised, and that, as a community, what we are trying to do, and we're seeing this emerge, is that the nature of what we call school reform is starting to become a more interactive communal experience. And that's not to say that there isn't a decade, 12 years of very deep wounds that still need to heal in this city.
Of course.
It was an incredibly violent storm, and the human engagement after it were even more violent. And so we are aware of that, and we are trying to become a community of people who lives out a commitment to saying, we will no longer test on communities, we will test beside and with them.
Yeah.
And that's starting to emerge, Marilyn. We're starting to see organizations, Electric Girls is a good example of an organization that grew up as a response to actual teen women's desires and fears and explanations of what that lived experience was. Yeah. And we're responding, Flora's responding to them in a way that I did not when I got here and started putting schools up. And to me, that's exciting. It's something that I certainly could never do on my own, but that's what gives me hope, is that, New Orleans has the chance to show the country what a human-centric approach to improving something as sacred as this public good of schooling could look like. It is very, very early days in that chapter, but we're starting to write it, and there are a lot of people with a pen contributing. And to me, that's the most profound and interesting contribution that I hope we can make.
Oh, and a fantastic metric for success too. You know, I think you're probably being a little hard on yourself. And I also know that a lot of innovators or people who would call themselves entrepreneurs start from a position of everybody should have this. Everybody will want this. That whether it's intentional or not, that arrogance of knowing what's better for other people. And it's only when you start focusing on really what are the real problems we're trying to solve for, that I think people start to shave off some of that those assumptions that make them feel like they know the only way forward. So, you know, that in itself is a great lesson. I want to just change gears for a few minutes and ask you about funding for education. And I know that part of your model is to focus, if you like, on the promising versus the proven. Share a little bit about what you're thinking there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'll just draw another number line.
Sure.
I think if you looked at a number line of what the average investment might look like, let's say this is $1 billion, let's say this is $1 million, this is 1,000, and this is just $1.
Mm-hmm.
What you see when you talk to philanthropy, many of the conversations I have with philanthropy have phrases like this: well, we scale what works. If you look at federal intervention in K-12 schooling, you see things like the Race to the Top initiative or I3. These are all basically, you know, programs that are based on the idea that we have found something that has proven to work, and we will now scale what's proven. And again, if we go back to that Hollywood graph I just erased, there's a lot of assumptions there that scaling something to serve all children works, that there's such a thing as working for all children. I have 3 children, and not a lot works for all 3 of them. I think there's also, so I think that this is a flawed mindset. Again, good intentions, no doubt. If I'm a philanthropist, I want to serve as many children as possible. So I get where the good intentions come from, but it is disturbing to me that if we speak about personalization and humanity and individualization and the struggle that we have had in this particular country to even recognize the basic humanity of everyone in the country, that we should not interrogate that construct at a deeper level. The last thing I'll add in sort of a analysis of this bias towards the right of this chart is that there are more than 13,000 school districts in this country. And to presume that you can just scale something across that type of disaggregated landscape is ignorant at best and inhumane at worst, because that's just impossible. And I think just acknowledging that of the public goods that we have as a democracy and a representative democracy, federalism has allowed for school to be a hyper-local public institution. And so these constructs of scale it everywhere are inherently going to be more difficult. And so what we have found is that it is very difficult to get funding, whether it is private capital, public capital, or philanthropy, to embrace the value of what promising might look like. And again, I have to give a lot of credit to y'all, to the folks who have made these concepts accessible to people like me. This is what we are trying to do. And the reason why, what I like about saying, you know, on average, what we invest in is $300 is that first check you get for an essentials pop-up, but you're getting $5,000 roughly in that whole investment. And then the tiny fellowship's roughly a $25,000 investment. And so what you see here is, if I could just bottle what it feels like to be at a camp here, is like, this is hope. You have a room full of 25 teams from all over the country believing that they can make a difference. And what's tragic about the way we have funded reform is that you can't get help with that until you have, quote, proven it.
Mhm.
The amount of times I've heard philanthropy say, come back to me in a few years once you've worked out the kinks.
Mhm.
That's a fine position to say if you are just the person who wants to make those big checks.
Yeah.
But I would beg of you, if that's your attitude,
Mhm.
are you at least talking to, do you know of, can you sleep well at night that there's somebody out there where they can go to work the kinks out?
Yeah. Well, and the kink is that one perfect solution that's going to suit every kid
Correct.
in 6th grade across the United States or whatever.
So the end game of the Hollywood blockbuster
Yeah. Mhm.
for all kids is a fallacy, number one. And two, the benefits of scale come with a profound ignorance about the diseconomies of scale. And this is something that I think I rolled up into New Orleans 12 years ago believing that I knew what the best models were. And all you had to do was just listen to me and deploy them. When in fact, the diversity of the co-creation, the necessity to listen to and truly care about what would make any neighborhood or any street in this town need a special type of school based on who they are and how they work in this city, in this world. Shame on me for presuming that institutional scale, that the Hollywood blockbuster was the movie they needed to see. And so, I think for me, I'm walking through this too, because I've spent most of my career thinking that, yeah, man, the success is over there. Anything that gets to be validated as scalable, nothing wrong with that. There are some things that are very powerful and could be shared. But when we're talking about individual children and individual communities, more often than not, human-centric design is where we should start, not institutional bigness as where we should start.
Well, Matt, I was going to ask you what's been your big surprise so far, but it sounds like you just described it.
Yeah.
So if you were going to start 4.0 schools all over again, what would you do differently?
Well, it goes back to what you asked about recruiting. And I'll tell you what I'm most interested in about the next few years. My co-partner, our chief operating officer, is a two-time alum of 4.0. His name is Hassan. And Hassan believes that our alumni are better coaches than our staff. And so over the last year, Hassan has redeployed our entire coaching spectrum to be delivered by alums to fellows. Fantastic. And so that's probably 3 or 4 staff that we don't need to hire. Instead, we hire 40 of our alums. And so if we look out into the future for 4.0, what we see is 20% of our budget is now being spent through those alumni in their relationship with fellows. And as Hassan and I think about the next few years, we say, could that be, what's the next 20% of the business that we could say to our alumni, you will be better at it than we, and so recruiting is on that list. So about 20 to 30% of our recruiting today is being done by alumni. In a year, my hope is that will be 100%. And so even in our own relationship with this institution, it's a tiny little institution, we are asking the question, how could we disassemble it and reposition those assets in the hands of our alumni who are one order of magnitude closer? They're a degree of separation closer to our clients, to our fellows, to the students and families they serve. How do we continue to make 4.0 less a function of the people who are full-time here and more a function of the people we serve? And to me, that, if I could start there 7 years ago and see where we are now, I'd do it. But as you said, the stumbly way from where we started to where we are is the path we've tried. And so
the journey.
That's where we're headed next.
Sure. Gosh, Matt, your passion is just so contagious. So maybe for my last question, let me just ask you, if we have people listening, and we have more than 25,000 people that pay attention to these webcasts, if we have potential educators, parents, kids, whatever, that are interested in finding out more about this or applying for a fellowship, what would you like them to know?
Well, first of all, if there's anything that 4.0 surprises, every time I walk into a camp or I go visit a pilot, this is a place where you can start telling your story. Mm-hmm. And I've thought about that as like, you know, if we had to change the name of 4.0, sometimes it's hard to type in the website. So the website is 4P as in Paul, T as in Tom, 0.org. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's the website, and there's some amazing resources there, stories of great pilots, how to apply to the program. But sometimes I'm like, that's a really hard website to remember. If I was renaming it, Hassan and I were talking about this, and I was like, we should call it Chapter 1. Like, this is the place where you can start writing your story about the future of school. And I believe that. And every time we have more than 2 people in the room, it becomes that. It becomes a network of people telling stories about what school could be. And in these pilots, what it is literally becoming hour by hour. And that to me is my inner teacher who often gets discouraged and thinks about how lonely this work can be at times. That is powerful, powerful medicine and a huge encouragement that this is a community where you can participate in a hopeful and rigorous approach to writing some new stories and the future of school being brighter than the present and more hopeful than the past.
Wow, what a fantastic opportunity. And I so hope that some of our listeners will take advantage of that and will reach out to you through 4.0.org.
Nailed it.
Matt, thank you so much for your time today. I am very grateful, and I'm sure our listeners will be as well.
Grateful to get an opportunity to talk with your community, and grateful for what we've learned from your community. It's a powerful set of constructs and a powerful community, and a very, very compelling and humanizing approach to making change in the world. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
All right.